This is 100 Years of Cox. You are listening to a podcast by Frances Thompson. I'm telling the story of 10 siblings from the Machell Cox family through the letters they wrote to each other. They were born in England between 1868 and 1884. 7 of them lived in England and 3 lived abroad in the colonies. These siblings are my family. Sibling number 2, Edmund, is my great-grandfather. The 10 siblings started writing a circular letter to each other called the Family Budget in 1906. They continued for the rest of their lives, and then their children continued the stream of letters. The last poignant letter was written in 1987 by David, Arthur's son. In this episode, the siblings talk about suffragettes and votes for women between 1906 and 1918. I must stress that these are not my views. These opinions were written by the siblings in letters more than 100 years ago. Some of them I disagree with, but then I'm not living in a world where men are in charge. Most houses don't have electricity, the poor end up in the workhouse, and the only news you hear comes in a newspaper at least a day after it has happened. World War I and an influenza pandemic also happened. And some women are so angry about injustice that they are militant and violent. I'm recording this episode in Brisbane on Sunday 8th of November 2020, and Joe Biden has been announced as the next President of the United States. The last 4 years of the Trump administration have been very polarising, and the whole world has been affected. Australia is on the other side of the world from the US, but many Australians are relieved at the news of a new president. In Australia, voting in elections is compulsory, but that is not the case in America or in the United Kingdom. If you don't bother to use your electoral vote, especially if you are a woman, Avice and Vera would be shouting at you from 100 years ago. They would be perplexed at people not bothering to vote today, when women had to fight so hard to get a vote in the early 1900s. I also include Arthur's fascinating letter about Armistice Day in Plymouth on Monday 11th of November. Arthur's birthday was November the 11th, and he writes an account of his birthday and the end of the war just a month before Avice votes in a general election for the first time. It was a very different world back then, but I hope you find their discussions interesting. Firstly, we have just odd snippets from letters. I've included bits of letters where the siblings mention suffragettes and what they think of them. Bernard's letter, Sydenham, November 28, 1906. P.S. Down with the suffragettes! Cuthbert's letter, Chapel Street, Berkhamsted, December the 3rd, 1906. O gentle and pleasant Veronica, beware of ambition. You won't get a vote even if you play hockey for England. Bernard's letter, March the 20th, 1908. The chief event in the family at present is of course Vera's appearance as an international and the match at Richmond. I made my way to the grandstand, where I found mother and father already in their seats in the middle of the second row, father being arrayed in a new overcoat and hat. Cuthbert and his friend Rawes arrived a few minutes later, only to find their seats, which were next to us, were already occupied by 2 ladies who firmly and positively refused to move, though Cuthbert had his tickets and they couldn't produce theirs. Not being suffragettes, we didn't like to chuck them out. I ignored them as their behaviour was quite rude, and father made pointed remarks to them. But he later on had to make it up with them, as he could not help himself and he had to talk about Vera to someone. Avice's letter, April 26th, 1908. The accounts of the great hockey match interested me greatly. We are all very proud of our sister, the International. But it made me quite angry reading about the ladies who took Cuthbert's seats and would not give up their seats even though Cuthbert produced his tickets. I cannot believe that father was then actually civil and talked to them about the match. Bernard, even though you are not a suffragette, you should still have insisted they moved. Poor Cuthbert. Why do ladies so often do it? I find it quite rude. Bernard's letter, June 30th, 1908. Probably most of you know that Hester and Carr marched in the great suffragette procession the other day to the Albert Hall. Carr carried a banner of Joan of Arc. A street boy called out as she passed, "Remember what happened to her?" I may perhaps be excused if I say in passing that theoretically I am in favour of women having votes, but honestly I should like to do all I could to prevent it. Very inconsistent. Cuthbert's letter, Branscombe, August the 20th, 1908. Miss Dean, our landlady, says human beings want rain just as much as vegetables. Bernard has already told you something of Miss Dean's character. She is as strong-minded as Miss Pankhurst. She loves Bernard, adores Dorothy, thinks little of Avice, Vera or me, and is doing her best, in combination with her brother, a retired sailor aged 60, to keep father in proper order. 2020 notes on the last two extracts. Hester and Carr were cousins of the siblings, and they pop up in budget letters quite often. Carr became a bit of a minor celebrity. She would probably have been an it girl if she had been born a few decades later. She goes up to Cambridge in 1906, which was in itself quite startling. Few women took a degree that early. She then met the poet Rupert Brooke, had a tempestuous relationship with him, and possibly had a miscarriage or a stillborn baby. She was his muse, was a member of the Bloomsbury set, and a friend of Virginia Woolf. The siblings are a bit shocked at Hester and Carr, and the siblings describe how they dressed in a radical and shocking way. Although the siblings never knew half of what I have found out about Carr, she was just their unusual cousin. Cuthbert's letter is written in Branscombe, a village on the south coast of Devon. The whole extended family spent August there in 1908. Miss Dean, their landlady, is a bit of a tartar. She develops favourites among the siblings. Bernard is her favourite, and she is not impressed with Cuthbert, Avice or Vera. She states that human beings want rain as much as vegetables, although the siblings, who are on their summer holidays, don't agree, and Cuthbert compares her to Miss Emmeline Pankhurst, who was by then the militant leader of the suffragette movement. Avice's letter, 5th of July 1909. I have a holiday this weekend, as Marjorie has gone away with Mrs. Brooks. I have been very brave, and I went into town by myself. After every little excursion I make, I feel so proud of myself, finding my way all alone. I have Burr's Baedeker Guide with me. I have just discovered the Natural History Museum, and I went on the London Underground. I walked there, and then I took the District line to get back to Victoria afterwards. I went to the museum, intending to look at the insects, as Marjorie is learning about bees and wasps this term. However, I looked at the bird part first. Well, I got there about 3:30, I suppose, and I did not leave until 5:30. I missed tea. I thought how interesting it all was. All the well-known British birds are there, with their nests and surroundings, most beautifully done. I never got to the insects at all. I should like to go again very much. I think I'm going to take Billy one morning, as there is so very much to see. I have also taken Billy up the monument the other day and enjoyed it very much. There is a wonderful view at the top. Mrs. Brooks said we were to go in a taxi, and I enjoyed that very much as well. I had never been up the monument before. It is awfully nice for me to be able to come home to Sydenham every day instead of staying with the Brookes in their house. However, I now see what a fool I was when I was in London before, when I worked for the Blagdens. I never knew what to do if I had an afternoon free, and I was afraid to go out into London by myself. Now I see there are heaps of things to do and see, and with scarcely any cost. Still, it was awfully scary going down into the underground on my own for the first time. 2020 notes on Avice's letter. In 1909, Avice is working as a governess for the extremely wealthy Brooks family, who own a large house in Portal, Tarporley, in Cheshire. Marjorie, who is also known as Billy, is the young girl who Avice teaches. In 1909, middle-class women were only just starting to venture out on their own without a chaperone. Avice is thrilled at how brave she is to enter the London Underground on her own, and now she's done it, she sees how easy it is, and finally she starts to explore London on her own, with the help of Bernard's Baedeker guidebook. I don't think it was so much men holding her back, it was Avice's lack of confidence, and her inability to see that she could explore London on her own, and she didn't need a brother to accompany her. Enid's letter. Liverpool, 26th of October, 1909. Cyril is very interested in his new position. He is to hold his first conference as Divisional Schools Inspector on Saturday, and then he entertains all the inspectors to lunch at his club. There is a woman inspector among the number, but as the club will not admit ladies, she has to come and lunch with me instead. I think I ought to go to the conference to chaperone her. Cuthbert's letter. Sydenham, January 1910. On the last day of term, my landlady had to give me notice, as she and her husband have got to give up the house and move. It is most annoying, as I was more comfortable there than anywhere else, and her cooking was really excellent. I suppose, however, I must consider myself lucky, as I have got new rooms quite close to the school, which are not at all bad. It means another 2 years for my vote. I shall actually have been in Berkhamsted 7 years before I can vote. 2020 notes on the last 2 letters. Cyril is Enid's husband. He is a senior schools inspector, and he's in charge of other inspectors in the northwest of England. He's a member of a gentlemen's club, which didn't admit women, and Enid is quite matter-of-fact about having to entertain the female inspector for lunch, whilst Cyril entertains the male inspectors at the club. It doesn't occur to Enid that it might be unfair that there were clubs where women were not allowed. Men were in charge, men were businessmen, and to Enid, as an Edwardian matron, it would be unthinkable that women could be on an equal footing with men in the world of business. If Enid was parachuted into our modern world, she would be shocked and overwhelmed. I think she would feel faint and might need a lie down. Votes for men were not straightforward either. If you owned your own house, or your own business, or you owned land, a man was entitled to a vote easily, especially if you were well educated. Cuthbert was a schoolmaster at Berkhamsted School near London, and he lived in lodgings. School teachers, despite being educated and in secure employment, clearly didn't get a vote if they kept moving between different lodgings, although I'm not sure how many years it took for a male school teacher to get a vote. Arthur's letter. Sydenham, January 1910. Enid, I always meant to ask you whether you are a suffragette. Your impressions of Mrs. Flora Annie Steele and Mrs. Humphrey Ward are interesting. I note that the one is majestic, the other merely autocratic, dogmatic, unsympathetic and philanthropic. I begin to tick the epithets off on my fingers, but alas, I find that my little finger is already occupied in laughing at you. Vera's letter, January 1910. We have a real-life suffragette living in Longton Avenue, one who has gone the whole hog. She has been in prison and all the rest. Well, their house is disfigured with huge suffragette posters. One enormous one was hung from a bedroom window, and it reached down to the top of the drawing-room window. It was headed, "The Right Dishonourable Double-Faced Asquith." Neville and Arthur determined that such a thing ought not to be. So on a Sunday evening, as soon as it was dark, they left the house with the intention of not returning unless they could bring the poster back with them. The house stands a bit back from the road, though it is in full view, and there is a little path up to the front door. They went boldly at it, and marched straight up to the front door. Arthur hoisted Neville onto the drawing-room window-sill, and with a great tearing rip the poster was theirs. They didn't wait a minute, but took to their heels and fled, and fortunately they got clear away. The joke of the matter was that when father was paying a call on an old Liberal gentleman the next day, he was told by this man that some friends of his son had bagged the same sort of poster from that very same house on Saturday night, the night before Neville and Arthur made their successful attempt. If they had known beforehand that one had already been torn down, they would never have dared to attempt it the second night running, and I think they were jolly lucky not to be caught, especially as the drawing-room window was all lighted up. Now the same objectionable poster is hung out all through the day, but it is carefully taken in at night. 2020 notes on Vera's letter. In 1910, Dr. Cox, Bernard and Vera and their two servants are living at 13 Longton Avenue in Sydenham, a street of large, comfortable villas. Mrs. Cox, mother, has died by this point. Unfortunately, Vera didn't say which house in their street was displaying the poster, entitled "The Right Dishonourable Double-Faced Asquith." Asquith, if you didn't know, was the Prime Minister in 1910. We now jump to 1912, and Cuthbert has stuck a newspaper article in the budget. The siblings used to paste all sorts of interesting clippings in the budget. Cuthbert's letter, February 20th, 1912. I put this newspaper clipping in because if only I could convince myself that giving votes to women would help to alter this attitude on the part of men, I should hesitate no longer. I do hate not being able to make up my mind. Avice, though I expect most of you would say it was very good for me not to feel certain about something for a change. County Court Judge comments on solicitor's questions. At the Shoreditch County Court yesterday, the judge strongly opposed a solicitor who sought to discredit a plaintiff's veracity by questioning her morality. Miss Tolley sued her former landlady to recover some furs left in her care, or their value, £19. The solicitor for the defence, who refused to give his name to the press, asked the plaintiff, "Were you not carrying on an intrigue with a married man?" Plaintiff, "I don't know what you are asking." Judge, if every woman who has misconducted herself is not to be believed on her oath in the witness box, what do you say as to men? Are they entitled to be believed? I do not disbelieve men because they have misconducted themselves. Apply the same rule to a man as you do to a woman, and where are you? You never ask a man whether he has been guilty of immorality, but you always ask a woman. Solicitor, I was only asking as a test of credibility. Judge, then bear in mind that a woman guilty of immorality is just as well able to tell the truth as you or I. You are asking me to disbelieve her in consequence of her immoral acts. I was just going to. I pay no attention to it. A woman is always attacked, but a man never. A woman who has misconducted herself is perfectly capable of telling the truth, and I am not going to pay the slightest attention to suggestions to the contrary. I beg your honour's pardon if I was overstepping the mark. Leave immorality out of it and get on with the case. 2020 notes on Cuthbert's letter. Cuthbert put this newspaper clipping in the budget, and he said if he thought that giving votes to women would help to alter this attitude on the part of men, he should hesitate no longer. But Cuthbert can't make up his mind. Cuthbert is not the only sibling who acknowledges that women are treated differently to men, but he's not sure that giving women the vote will change this. In 1912, the judge said, if every woman who has misconducted herself is not to be believed on her oath in the witness box, what do you say as to men? Are they entitled to be believed? You never ask a man whether he has been guilty of immorality, but you always ask a woman. Cuthbert had underlined this section. And another thing that jumps out at me, the judge says the woman has misconducted herself and is guilty of immorality because she's had an affair with a married man. I'm not sure a judge would say that today. Vera's letter, March the 2nd, 1912. I am still bubbling over with excitement at having got into the English team once more, and I feel much more like going out to help the idiotic suffragettes break shop windows than settling down to writing a sensible letter. I felt pretty sure I should get into the team again, and yet I am almost as excited as the first time I got in. Edmund's letter, March the 12th, 1912. I should like to know your feelings all round as to the suffragettes. Please express your opinions in the space I have left below. Those who would grant their demands in full. Avice, probably. Enid, yes, but not in full. Bernard, yes. Cuthbert, rather a big order, but yes, I think so. Wilfrid, yes. Aldwin, more or less. Those who would not grant them anything. Edmund, Arthur, Vera. Those who approve of their present methods. Avice, not of the Women's Social and Political Union, WSPU. Bernard, not of their militant behaviour, and I didn't when they first started. 7 siblings don't approve of militant suffragette behaviour. Wilfrid, Aldwin, Edmund, Enid, Cuthbert, Arthur and Vera. Any other remarks in brief? Edmund, their conduct has alienated all sympathy. Avice, I find the short-sighted conduct of the Women's Social and Political Union most disgraceful. Cuthbert, I have joined Mrs. Fawcett's society. 2020 notes on Edmund's letter. Edmund did not approve of anything the suffragettes were doing, and he had no time at all for their demands. He was not sure which of his siblings agreed with him, so he asks for everyone's opinion in the budget. Edmund was old-fashioned, and he thought women belonged at home and that men should be in charge of everything. Whereas Bernard, Wilfrid, Cuthbert and even Aldwin in Africa thought women should be granted the vote, although they didn't approve of the suffragettes being violent. Cuthbert has even joined Mrs. Fawcett's society. If you are interested, look up Millicent Fawcett, who was a prominent leader of the suffragette movement. She is less well known than Mrs. Pankhurst and her daughters, but equally influential, and was another trailblazer for women's rights at the turn of the century. I've just read a fascinating article on her on the website historytoday.com. Enid's letter, March 19th, 1912. Edmund, I have no time. I am really exceedingly busy. to write a treatise on the woman's suffrage question. Of course, I much dislike all militant methods and think them wrong, but the fact that a small section of suffragettes have disgraced themselves does not affect my opinion of the justice of the claim that women, as women, should have a share in the government of the nation. I feel quite indignant with the humbug of those men who say that women are unfit for politics and that their sphere is the home, etc., and yet in the same breath beg women to canvass for them at the next election. Avice's letter, March 28, 1912, written from the Falmouth Hotel in Falmouth. Cuthbert, I was most interested in your newspaper clipping. You'll be interested to hear I went to a women's suffrage meeting here with Mrs. Brooks, and it was most interesting. It was well attended. There is a branch of the non-militant party here in Falmouth, the law-abiding ones. The speaker was a Mrs. Radcham. She had a most determined jaw when not speaking, and did not look prepossessing because of it. But her face quite altered when speaking and softened. She was a good speaker, so clear and witty as well. She was so much in earnest and not in the least ranting. It was a most helpful address. I do wish you could have heard it. A resolution was passed in favour of the Conciliation Bill. If you have not already decided, I shall like to discuss it with you, but not in writing. I certainly think that giving votes to women would help to raise the moral standard for men to what is expected of women. I think the judge in that case might have said, "A woman is always attacked," and I wish I could say the same of the man. Bernard's letter, 7th of April, 1912. Women's suffrage seems to be the question of the moment in the budget just now. I can't give an unqualified answer to Edmund's questions, as I don't know what the suffragettes' demands in full are. Somebody has just lately taken to sending me Votes for Women, the official publication of the WSPU, the Militant Society. It is quite amusing reading, but anybody who takes it seriously must, I think, have an unbalanced mind. They say, we demand the vote on the same terms as it is or may be granted to men. This does not go far enough for me. I should give the vote to all men and women over the age of 25. I am in favour of women having votes, though I am not keen about it, and I don't think it is a question of extreme importance. I read the whole debate on the second reading of the Conciliation Bill and found Sir Edward Grey's speech the most convincing in favour of it. I didn't think much of Asquith's speech. These are some of the quotations from the Conciliation Bill which appealed to me. In this country, we have 5 million women earning their own living. There was not a question which came before the House of Commons that did not affect millions of women. The Australian Senate recently passed a resolution saying the extension of the suffrage to women in Australia had been attended with the most beneficial results. Women are capable of canvassing and instructing the male voters on how to vote, but apparently 5 minutes in the ballot box would be too much for them. Men habitually consult with their womenfolk on most important questions and very frequently act on their advice, and it is absurd to say, when it came to the parliamentary vote, that women were incapable of exercising it. As to the violence of the militant party, says Bernard, I agree with Enid that their violence does not affect the justice of their claim. Sir Edward Grey said, I have a natural reluctance to be driven by acts of violence out of a course which I approve, just as natural as to be driven into a course which I do not approve by outbreaks of violence. In relation to the argument of physical force, this is what Sir Edward Grey said. One argument against women's suffrage, which I think is shallow and weak, is the argument of physical force. All law and order rests upon force. The sanction of force must be there, but what decides how the force is to be used? Without public opinion behind it, you will find it is not really the sanction of the force upon which the stability of public life rests, but the sanction of public opinion, which directs the force, and in accordance with which force must be used. Honourable members and others oppose giving political votes to women because they say women cannot serve in the army or navy. How many honourable members do it? If the argument of physical force is to be pushed to its logical conclusion, why not decide our votes tonight by physical force? Bernard continues, I don't quite know why it should be regarded as a certainty that giving votes to women would help to raise the standard of morality for men. Women's standard of morality is naturally superior to man's, but I think it is quite open to argument that this is partly due to the more secluded life that women lead and a lack of equal opportunity for evil. Vera is still at the nursing home due to the operation on her knee, and it seems very curious to have the house full of family without Vera here. She took her operation quite as a matter of course and was very plucky about it. I should not at all like to have only a local anaesthetic. Vera has swarms of sympathisers. In fact, so many girls called here at the house at first that the police began to think Christabel Pankhurst was concealed here. Bernard's letter, June the 8th, 1913. Poor old Tom is to be shelved, or rather sent to the Home for Lost Dogs. Sad though it is quite time. The reason being that he hasn't been in good health for some time, and the vet can't do anything more for him. The Home for Lost Dogs possesses a lethal chamber where animals can be painlessly destroyed. What a pity that suffragettes can't be sent there. I think, however, the militant movement will not last much longer. I hope not, as I am beginning to think that people who so easily succumb to the militant argument must have very ill-balanced minds and are not fit to vote. Probably the majority of the older women are not sane. It is a great shame that young girls should be influenced in this way, and some of them are told that all men are brutal, and women are never considered in Parliament or courts of law, and I suppose some of them believe it. We are now up to 1913 and budget number 74. Between September 1906 and November 1918, the siblings have written 74 editions of the budget. That is a lot of letters, filled with a fascinating amount of news, posted around the world, from England to Africa to Canada. Some were lost in the post, but not that many. Sometimes my eyes ache as I try to decipher particularly messy handwriting, but in general, the siblings wrote more legibly than many people do today. In October 1918, the budget was lost in the post, and 3 siblings write a letter to restart the budget. They express sadness in their letters at the loss of the budget, and they say, we must start the budget on its rounds again. Enid and Arthur both wrote a letter on Tuesday, November the 12th, 1918, describing Armistice Day and the end of the war. Enid described the day in Wolverhampton, where she and Cyril now live, and Arthur described the scene at Mount House Prep School in Plymouth. This podcast is about votes for women and elections, but I couldn't ignore Armistice Day as I was reading budget letters this week. Avice wrote a momentous letter about the great responsibility she felt when voting in a general election for the first time in December 1918. Just a month before, Arthur wrote his account of Armistice Day, which was also the date of his birthday. Every year, the headmaster's birthday was an excuse for a party and extra food. And in 1918, Arthur's birthday celebrations coincided with the end of World War I. I will now read you some excerpts from it. Arthur's letter, 12th of November 1918. Yesterday at 5 a.m. I woke up to concentrate my thoughts upon the organised festivities of my birthday, which always occasioned me much anxious thought. At that very hour, something equally important was happening, which our grandchildren will have to learn about. I wonder what Roger and David will claim to remember about it. It is a curious reflection that I have many boys in the school now who do not remember the time when we were not at war. Despite the misfire of last week, the great news was very well stage managed in the end, and we got the news long before London through Admiralty House. A few minutes after 9 a.m, I heard a single siren start galumphing in the Hamoaze, and I called out to the boys to listen and see if it is taken up. Almost at once, the air was throbbing with every weird noise that steam can produce, and I felt sure we could accept the news this time. Bullen appeared as if by magic and ran our flag up, and the boys yelled. Directly afterwards, the bell went for school, and we had the whole staff of domestics from both houses, and all the boys crowded together up here for prayers. We must have offered almost the first Thanksgiving. We sang hymn number 166. We had the prayer for the King and the thanksgiving for peace and deliverance, and then we sang God Save the King right through. It was really very moving on the spur of the moment. Then I had the usual birthday presentation, which is not less embarrassing, because the tradition is to deposit the offering on my desk before prayers. I have to ignore it until the head prefect steps out and solemnly uncovers it without a word. I was honestly taken by surprise by a very delightful wristwatch, the sort of thing which supplies a want that I never realised until I possessed it. A few well-chosen words of appreciation, written beforehand, coupled with a suspiciously apt impromptu, sufficed to thank the generous donors, and then we proceeded to a whole holiday. Fortunately, at the time of the false alarm last week, we rendered our deficiency in the matter of bunting and flags, and we made a brave display, particularly with a line of flags run across the playground on a string from the nursery window to the tree opposite. The scouts changed into uniform, and we all made our way forthwith into Plymouth. It was very thrilling when we met a very long improvised procession of wounded soldiers with a couple of brass bands. Swarms of people appeared from nowhere, but it was too early for anything organised. It was only just as we got to the Western Morning News office that the official confirmation was posted up at 11 o'clock. In the afternoon, we occupied ourselves mainly with collecting green boughs for a huge bonfire in the playground. At present, I don't believe it is really permissible to have one, but I expect we shall get leave from the police soon. After an early tea, we began our evening festivities, and the fun was fast and furious, till at 8:30 the boys departed to bed fairly exhausted. We received the news that Christopher was gazetted yesterday as a second lieutenant. I don't know when I felt so much to be thankful for. I think we all of us, who are similarly situated, must be realising very poignantly what we owe to those who have paid the cost. I am voting for Shirley Benn this time. Dorothy declares she will vote for Astor, but she is not our candidate. I am sparing you my views on things in general. I hope, however, to hear that all the recently deposed crowned heads who are not assassinated will be permanently lodged at St. Helena and take in one another's washing. Yours once more, Arthur. 2020 notes on Arthur's letter. Arthur says there was a misfire last week, but the premature peace announcement meant that the school is now organised with flags and bunting to hang up. Much of Plymouth's news came from the multiple ships in the harbour, who sounded their sirens when things happened. By 1918, Arthur has sold Garfield House, which was close to Devonport, and he's bought a much larger property at the end of Hartley Road in Plymouth, which at that time was out in the countryside and mostly surrounded by fields. Mount House School had many more boys and a large field. It was on a hill and it had great views across to Plymouth Hoe and the sea and the Devonport dockyards. The boys would have been able to see the naval warships from the playground, as well as the multiple boats, all with their sirens loudly indicating the end of the war. It must have been an amazing picture. Interestingly, in describing the ship's sirens, Arthur spells the word S-Y-R-E-N. It's now considered an archaic spelling of the word siren, but it was clearly the correct spelling in 1918. Arthur was too good at English to have got that wrong. November the 11th, which we now know as Armistice Day and celebrate with red poppies, was also Arthur's birthday. Every year it was an excuse for a whole school celebration, including games, cake and extra food. The armistice happened to ambush the celebrations that had already been planned for the boys of Mount House School. Arthur and Dorothy's youngest sons are Roger and David, who were aged 8 and 5. Arthur is aware that the events of Armistice Day will be something to tell the grandchildren about. He would frankly be amazed at the great-granddaughter of his brother reading his account, as I am today. If you have never heard of the word Hamoaze, it is the name for the tidal stretch of water directly adjacent to the naval dockyards of Devonport, where two rivers flow out into the sea, and if I'm pronouncing it inaccurately, my apologies. Christopher was Dorothy and Arthur's eldest son, and he was a brilliant scholar. He went on to have a stellar career at New College, Oxford, as well as being educational advisor to the Colonial Office, for which he received a knighthood. He travelled the world, setting up schools and universities in every single country that had formerly been a British colony. He never married, although he wanted to. Work kept getting in the way. In the last few weeks of World War I, he is 18 years old. He has passed his exams for the army, and he was gazetted as a lieutenant on the very day that peace was declared. An extremely close call for Christopher. Enid's son, Owen, died in the trenches in France in 1915, and Arthur's huge relief that his son will not fight in the Great War is very clear. And if you don't know the history of Napoleon, you won't understand Arthur's final remark. In 1815, the British government chose St. Helena, which was a barren, windswept island in the South Atlantic Ocean, as a place of detention for Napoleon Bonaparte. Arthur is giving his opinion and recommending that all the crowned heads of state who have lost the war and not been assassinated should all be imprisoned on St. Helena. By December 1918, Avice was married to Cecil Moore, who was the piano-playing Irishman who previously taught at Garfield House School. The First World War is over, but neither Cecil, who was a teacher, nor Bernard, a stockbroker, are home yet from the war. Bernard said that he filled in just one form to sign up as a soldier, but it takes many more forms to be released from service. Father, Dr. Cox, is not well. He's had a stroke and he's in a nursing home. Vera reads him the news from the paper, and Dr. Cox is very pleased to have a small Union Jack flag in his room and a rosette on his nightshirt, celebrating the Armistice. Avice was in Sydenham with Vera for Armistice Day and had a very exciting time in London, seeing huge crowds, rows of captured guns, thousands of flags, and the King, the Queen, and Princess Mary on the balcony of Buckingham Palace. By December, Avice is back at home in Hengistbury Road, Southbourne-on-Sea, which is just to the east of Bournemouth, where the nurse has been looking after her 2 young sons whilst Avice was in Sydenham visiting father. She then goes to a lot of political meetings to decide how to wisely use her first vote. The 1918 general election was called immediately after the end of the First World War. Avice's letter, December 16th, 1918. Cleeve, Hengistbury Road, Southbourne-on-Sea. This budget has been delayed owing to my great interest in the general election. I quite appreciated having a vote, but I could not make up my mind how to give it. Aren't you amused, Vera? You see, we had no true coalition candidate here, or I should certainly have voted for him. There was Brigadier General Page Croft, who has been returned as a Unionist for 8 or 10 years, I believe, for the National Party, and the Reverend F.J. Hopkins, Primitive Methodist, for Labour, and on nomination day Mr. Keighley appeared as a Liberal, but not for the coalition. I could not at first find out the times of any meetings, as the Bournemouth daily paper is not sold in Southbourne, and no notices were put up of any meetings, and I couldn't find the committee rooms. Page Croft is, I believe, generally in London, but his wife lives here. Hopkins, who is Labour, came from Yarmouth to contest the seat, but said if he were elected, he would move and reside in Bournemouth. Keighley, the Liberal, came from Surrey. At last I found that the weekly Bournemouth paper gave notices of political meetings, and I hurried round to hear all 3 men in the last week before the election. Only one canvasser came to me from Page Croft when I was out, and his election addresses arrived about 2 or 3 days before polling day. I asked Page Croft at one of his earlier meetings whether he called himself a coalition candidate, and he said he did not, as he wished to be free and not bound by a pledge, but that he would support the coalition and Lloyd George so long as they remained true to the coalition programme, and that he must be free to speak against any abuses. Still, Lloyd George and Bonar Law must know him, and they did not send him their letter. I then sent Page Croft some written questions to answer at a meeting dealing with the coalition programme, such as Home Rule, the House of Lords, India Reform, and the nationalisation of railways, and he seemed to me always a little lagging behind the coalition programme. He gave a very scanty appreciation of Lloyd George at an earlier meeting, and never mentioned him at all otherwise at 2 other meetings. But at the final political meeting I went to, everyone on the platform got up and praised Lloyd George, following the feeling of the meeting, and I felt quite disgusted with Page Croft, as certainly he did it only to get votes. It wasn't genuine with him, or he would have said it sooner. He found he must pose as the coalition candidate if he were to get in, as he probably will. Page Croft is not, at present, for nationalisation of the railways, and he voted against the Labour amendment for raising the minimum agricultural wage from 25 shillings to 30 shillings, which was, however, carried. I asked him why, if he were for the coalition, he had not received the coalition letter, and he said, "Because the only ticket I want for returning me to Westminster is yours." He is all right, but rather too plausible, I felt. Keighley was no good. He is an Asquith man, and said he would support coalition until peace was signed. He was clever looking, with a nice face, but too old and testy, and mainly talked of Home Rule. Hopkins interested me. He is not a violent Labour Party man, and not at all Bolshevist or pacifist. But at their last big meeting, they expressed great bitterness against Lloyd George, mainly because they wouldn't believe him, or that he wouldn't get his followers to do what he said. Also, they sang a song called God Save the People with fervour, and Ben Smith made a fiery speech which aroused some class feeling and evoked a call from the audience that anyhow Ramsay MacDonald was better than Lloyd George. The only bid they made for the coalition vote that I heard was this: well, Page Croft isn't really a coalitionist, and certainly is not the man to lecture on the democratic measures of the coalition, and if anyone here chooses to believe Lloyd George does mean to carry out his measures and can do so, well, we are with him in that to see that he does. So, after this long rigmarole, you will be glad to hear, or you are perhaps indifferent, that I voted for Hopkins and Labour, as I do believe Lloyd George, and I think he would rather have a Labour man, who was not a fire-eater personally, where there was not a coalition man. I know he wants Labour in Parliament to a certain extent, so long as they are not in majority to form a ministry. I have no fear of a Labour government, but I don't want that yet, as Enid also says. And also I fear they won't be strong enough to carry out their most extreme doctrines, and perhaps a Labour government would be too lenient to Germany. I feel sure Hopkins will do far better for the reconstruction programme than Page Croft would. The only thing I fear is Labour's collaboration with Sinn Féin. I believe 5,000 women votes have been added to the register here in Bournemouth. This is the first election where Bournemouth will rank as a borough in itself. Wilfred has not yet got a vote. I think Cecil has voted Page Croft, as most people would, I think. However, the Labour and Liberal candidates never got their election addresses out to Cecil. You must excuse this long ramble, but after all, it is my first vote, so there is some excuse, and it was a curious antagonistic feeling at each meeting. I never voted for the resolution at any of the meetings. We had a victory band week here, and tanks were here as well. I took Desmond to see a procession of tanks through Bournemouth, and airships flew overhead and dropped pamphlets. Desmond was very excited. Then I went with a friend to see tanks in action at Mayrick Park, which was most interesting. It was fascinating seeing tanks climbing hills and coming down, going over trenches and over piles of logs 8 feet high. It would be awful to see a huge tank yawning above one, but they don't look so alarming from the side or in the distance. I think they must be very demoralising to a foe. A tank man told me the Whippet tanks could go 16 miles an hour over rough ground, but they had to go carefully over the roads or they would tear them up. I took Desmond to a lantern lecture at the school about birds, and he was very good and very interested. He is very keen to learn about anything. Geoffrey is fat and energetic, but has a bit of a cold and is not quite up to the mark. Thank you, Arthur and Aldwyn, specially for your most splendid letters. Cuthbert's fine letter about camp I had already read before, and I sent it back to Vera to put in the budget. Your loving sister, Avice. 2020 notes on the 1918 election. I find it fascinating looking things up online that the siblings talk about in their letters. In 1918, Henry Page Croft was returned to Westminster as an MP with the National Party, despite Avice being unimpressed with him. He then held the seat of Bournemouth until 1940. And women over the age of 30 got the right to vote for the first time, So I think both Avice and Vera were among the 8.5 million women who voted for the first time in December 1918. 10 years later, in 1928, women over the age of 21 were allowed to vote, and women gained electoral equality with men for the first time. Wilfred has now returned from Canada due to ill health, and he is working as a teacher at the same school in Bournemouth as Avice and Cecil. He said this about the 1918 general election. I cannot say I felt particularly thrilled over the election. Bournemouth had rather a poor selection of candidates. If I had been on the register, I think I should have voted for Page Croft. The Labour candidate must have been unusually moderate when Avice heard him. I was told he was talking awful rot at a street corner. In the same letter, Wilfred also said this. Father has rallied and seems to be improving slightly. I had to go up to town this morning to get him a bottle of brandy, as it is unobtainable in Sydenham. I used Enid's Army and Navy Stores ticket and was successful in my quest, but it was a solemn and awe-inspiring function. I didn't realise there was rationing during World War I, but I've just looked it up online and found that rationing was introduced in January 1918 as panic buying was leading to shortages in the shops. So much in 1918 is comparable to events today in 2020. The siblings also talk a great deal about influenza and the epidemics at the different schools they work at, and a lot of people being ill. But interestingly, not once is flu called a pandemic in the budget letters. Avice's young son Desmond loved the procession of tanks in Bournemouth, and Geoffrey is a fat and healthy baby. Sadly, Avice and Cecil have grief ahead of them. Geoffrey dies of appendicitis, age 6, and Desmond, in his early 20s, signs up and dies fighting in World War II. But they did have a third child, a much-loved daughter. Bernard said in a later letter that he would love to hear Avice heckling at an election meeting. Standing up and asking questions in a public meeting would have probably been a brave thing for a woman to do in 1918. Avice had to find out where the political meetings were taking place, then go in person and sit and listen to each candidate's policies. With the internet and 24-hour news, it is so much easier for us to find out information today. At a later election after the war, Bernard talks about going to Leicester Square to stand and listen as the results come in. Completely unimaginable to us today. Enid said that she hoped Labour would not win the general election in 1918. She said she was sure there will be a Labour government in the future, but she felt Labour were not yet sufficiently educated for the responsibility of government. This was clearly a time when not all politicians had been to university. Henry Page Croft had a wealthy background. He'd been educated at Eton College and then Cambridge University, like so many other Conservative politicians. And if you don't know your politics, Lloyd George was Welsh. He was a member of the Liberal Party and he was the Prime Minister in 1918. He was in charge of a coalition government alongside Bonar Law, who led the Conservatives. The two men sent endorsement letters to the men who supported the coalition government, which is what Avice is talking about in her letter. This episode was going to be more about the 1907 Christmas budget, which I started reading in the last podcast episode. But then I read Avice's letter about the 1918 general election, and I decided to make this episode about suffragettes and votes. I also realised that it was Arthur's birthday on Armistice Day. So in a couple of days, on November 11th, I will be wishing Arthur a happy birthday. If he was alive, he would be 150 years old. Fancy that. As I record this, the news is full of the election in America. Racial tension, white supremacy and guns are currently huge issues in America. But Joe Biden will be the next president, and people across the world are hoping and praying for some calm and a return to normality and decency. 2020 is becoming an even more historical year, just like 1918 was, when women gained the vote for the first time, as the First World War ended and peace was declared, whilst an influenza pandemic continued. In the next episode of 100 Years of Cox, I will read some more from the 1907 Christmas budget. We have loads more literary offerings which provided great amusement to the family over the Christmas holidays 113 years ago. Arthur writes a piece about misdemeanor Machell, which is a gently mocking story all about Avice. Bernard writes a clever poem about the 6 wives of Henry VIII, which his schoolmaster brothers say is so good that they will use it now to teach Tudor history to their schoolboys. Enid writes a prize competition where the answer to each general knowledge question can be found among the letters of the word inhospitable. Despite this helpful clue, myself and some friends managed to only get 8 correct out of a total of 21 questions. And that was despite us cheating and using the internet when we got stuck. I do hope Enid gives us the answers in 1908. Have a think about this one. What is the capital of one of the Balkan states? I presume that the Balkan states are still Albania, Croatia, Serbia, Romania, etc. I don't know how many letters the answer is, but the answer consists of some of the letters from the word inhospitable. Letters can only be used once, and you don't have to use them all. Answers on a postcard if you work it out, or send me an email, or put it up on Twitter. 100 Years of Cox. The Machell Cox Budget letters and all content is subject to copyright and belongs to both myself and the Bodleian Library in Oxford. Machell Cox Letters is on Twitter, where I share all sorts of things, @CoxLetters. If you have any questions, please write to me. I'd love to know what you think. Send me an email, machellcoxletters@gmail.com. Especially if you can work out what is the capital of one of the Balkan states, where the letters come from the word inhospitable, because I haven't worked out the answer. You have been listening to 100 Years of Cox. Thank you for listening.